The brass knob on the back door had a wobble to it. Elias noticed it every morning, same as he had for the past 7 years. Most people would have fixed it right away, replaced the old thing with something shiny and new. But Elias wasn't most people. He turned it slow and gentle, the way you'd lift a newborn foal, and stepped into the kitchen. The clock on the wall read 5:47 a.m. Same as always. He moved through the darkness without switching on a single light. Didn't need to. Every creaky floorboard, every drafty window, every chip in the blue paint on the doorframe, he knew them all by heart. His boots made soft sounds on the old linoleum, the kind of sound that belonged to a man who wasn't trying to hide, just wasn't trying to announce himself either. The coffee was cold in the pot from last night. Elias poured it into his thermos anyway. Waste not, want not. That's what Cora's father used to say. That man had been gone 6 years now, but his words still hung in the air like dust motes in the afternoon sun. Through the window above the sink, Elias watched the yard. The big oak near the gate. The fence line running east toward the creek. The dark shapes of cattle moving slow in the distance. He wasn't really looking for anything specific. Just looking. A habit from all those years of watching over things that weren't technically his. The property ran about 240 acres just outside of Livingston, Montana. Nice spread. Good water. Cora kept it running smooth, but she couldn't be everywhere at once. That's where Elias came in. Fixing what broke. Minding what mattered. Asking no questions about the past. There was a drawer in the study, top one on the right, that he dusted around but never opened. Didn't need to see what was inside to know it hurt her. Some things you just feel. The sun started showing itself around 6:20 that morning. August 14th, Elias remembered the date because it was supposed to be hot later, maybe 90 degrees, and he'd planned to check the irrigation on the south pasture. Simple day. Good day. Then the sound came. At first, it was just a rumble far off, the kind that could be thunder or a truck on the county road. But it got louder fast. Too fast. The kind of engine that meant business, meant distance, meant somebody wasn't just passing through. Elias set his thermos down slow. The sound grew mean and throaty, bouncing off the hills, until it stopped abrupt right at the main gate. The sudden quiet after was worse than the noise. Like the whole ranch held its breath. Elias didn't move. Didn't even blink. He just stood there at the window, his reflection ghosting back at him in the glass. Grey at the temples. Lines around the eyes. A face that had seen enough to know when something was off. He whispered to himself, barely moving his lips. Didn't think he'd come back on 2 wheels. The words sat heavy in the quiet kitchen. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking. Weren't calling out. Just sitting there at the gate like they owned the place. Like they had all the time in the world. Elias thought about the day Cora's father died. Car accident over by the pass. Icy road, they said. Wrong place, wrong time. But Elias had seen the skid marks afterward, the way they curved deliberate, like somebody had meant to go off that edge. He never told Cora that part. Some things you keep to yourself. Now this. He watched the gate through the window. The sun was climbing proper now, painting everything gold and orange. Pretty morning. The kind you'd want to paint or photograph or just sit and appreciate. Elias wasn't appreciating much of anything. His hand rested on the window frame, fingers tapping slow. The wood there was worn smooth from years of the same motion. Same spot. Same worries dressed up different. He thought about Cora still asleep upstairs. 28 years old. Running a ranch alone since she was 22. Tough as they come, but soft in ways she tried to hide. She'd be waking soon, padding down in her socks, pouring coffee, asking about the day. Would she hear the engine too? Would she know? The gate stayed shut. The motorcycle stayed put. Whoever it was, they were waiting for something. Sunrise maybe. Or just working up the nerve. Elias turned from the window and walked to the back door. He put his hand on that wobbly brass knob and stood there a long moment. 7 years he'd been turning it gentle. 7 years of mornings just like this one. But this morning was different. He could feel it in his bones, the way old injuries ache before a storm. Something was coming through that gate, one way or another. Something that would change the shape of things. Elias opened the door and stepped outside. The air smelled like hay and dew and the distant pine of the mountains. A rooster crowed somewhere down the road. Normal sounds. Ordinary morning. But at the gate, a man sat on a dusty Harley, one boot on the ground, watching the house with eyes that didn't blink enough. He was too far away to see clearly. Just a shape. A silhouette against the rising sun. But Elias knew. Didn't matter that it had been years. Didn't matter that he'd hoped never to see that shape again. Some people leave tracks on your memory that don't wash out. Elias walked toward the barn, not toward the gate. Let the man wait. Let him wonder. Elias had chores, and chores didn't stop for ghosts. But his hands were shaking just a little as he reached for the barn door latch. And behind him, the motorcycle engine growled once, short and sharp, like a dog testing its chain. The cows shifted uneasy in the near pasture. The sun kept rising. And the wobbly brass knob on the back door waited for a hand that wouldn't touch it gentle anymore. The mantel clock in the hallway read 7:12 a.m., but the dust motes floating in the slants of morning light seemed frozen in place. Elias noticed things like that now. How time could feel like it was standing still even when your heart was pounding fast. He stood in the shadow of the barn, just inside the big door where the light didn't reach. His gut had gone tight and cold, the way it used to feel back in other days, other places he didn't talk about. The kind of feeling that wasn't fear exactly, but knew fear personally. The man at the gate had killed the engine finally. Now he was just sitting there on that dusty Harley, one boot planted on the ground, staring at the ranch like he was measuring it for something. Then he looked at the herd. Not at the house. Not at the barn where Elias stood hidden. At the cattle. Counting them. Judging them. The way a man looks at something he already considers his. Elias's fingers curled into fists before he even realized what he was doing. His nails bit into his palms, sharp little moons of pressure. He forced himself to breathe slow. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The air smelled like hay and horses and the faint oil of old machinery. Normal smells. Grounding smells. Behind him, he heard the kitchen door open. Cora stepped onto the porch in her socks, no boots, still holding her coffee mug like it was the only solid thing in the world. She was wearing that old blue robe of hers, the one with the frayed collar. Her dark hair was pulled back messy, not fixed yet for the day. She saw the man at the gate. Her hand flew to her throat, pressing against the skin there like she needed to feel her own pulse to believe she was still real. The coffee mug tipped in her other hand, a little brown splash hitting the porch boards. She didn't notice. Elias stepped out of the barn shadow. He didn't run. Didn't rush. Just walked calm and steady, placing himself between the porch and the gate. Between her and whatever was coming. His shadow stretched long in the morning sun, reaching toward the fence line. The man at the gate watched him come. And then he grinned. It was a slow thing, that grin. The kind that shows teeth on purpose. A gold tooth caught the light on the left side of his mouth. Elias remembered that gold tooth from years ago. Remembered exactly where he'd seen it last. The man swung his leg over the bike and stood up. He was shorter than Elias remembered, but wider. Thick through the chest and shoulders. A snake tattoo coiled around his throat, its head resting just below his ear. The tattoo moved when he swallowed. He walked to the gate and put his hands on the top rail, casual, like he owned it. "Cora Lee," he called out, his voice rough as gravel. "You grew up pretty." Cora didn't answer. Elias could hear her breathing behind him, quick and shallow. The man's eyes slid to Elias. "And you? Still hanging around, huh? Figured you'd have drifted by now. That's what strays do." Elias said nothing. Just stood there. The man laughed, a short sound with no humor in it. "Name's Leland. In case you forgot. Me and Cora's daddy went way back." Cora's voice came small from the porch. "My daddy's dead." Leland nodded slow. "I know, sweetheart. I know. That's exactly why I'm here. He reached into his jacket pocket. Elias tensed, ready to move. But Leland just pulled out a piece of paper, yellow and wrinkled, creased down the middle from years of folding. He held it up like a prize. Your daddy and me had a deal. Half this ranch belongs to me. Has for years. He just never got around to telling you, I guess. Elias watched Cora's face go pale. Saw her grip the porch rail like the ground was tilting under her feet. That's a lie, she whispered. Leland shrugged. Paper don't lie. He tapped the document with one thick finger. Signed and dated. August 3rd, 2014. Right before he took that drive up the pass. Elias remembered that date. Remembered Cora's daddy coming back from town that day, looking older than he had that morning. Looking like a man carrying something heavy. Cora shook her head. He wouldn't. He built this place. Every fence. Every building. He wouldn't sell half to anybody. Leland grinned again, that gold tooth winking. Didn't sell. Lost. In a game over at Butte. Your daddy liked to gamble, sweetheart. He just wasn't very good at it. The words hung in the air like smoke. Elias thought about the locked drawer in the study. About the way Cora's daddy used to disappear some weekends, come back quiet and tired. About the skid marks on that icy road that looked too deliberate to be an accident. Cora made a sound. Small. Broken. The kind of sound a person makes when the world rearranges itself and leaves them somewhere they don't recognize. Leland folded the paper slow and put it back in his pocket. I'm not here to be ugly about it. Just here to claim what's mine. I'll be staying in the bunkhouse until we get things sorted. He looked at Elias. You got a problem with that? Elias looked back at him. Didn't blink. Didn't move. Leland laughed again and walked toward the bunkhouse, dragging a duffel bag from his bike as he went. The gate swung shut behind him with a clang that echoed off the hills. Elias turned to Cora. She was sitting on the porch steps now, her coffee mug forgotten beside her, both hands pressed flat against the wood like she needed to feel something solid. He owe me, Leland had said. Now you owe me. 7 words that changed everything. Elias walked to the porch and sat down next to her. Not too close, just close enough. They watched the bunkhouse door where Leland had disappeared. Watched a light come on inside. The morning sun kept rising, warm on their faces, like nothing had happened. Like the world hadn't just cracked open. Cora spoke without looking at him. Did you know? Elias thought about lying. Thought about protecting her just a little longer. But she deserved better than that now. No, he said. But I should have. She nodded slow. Reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were cold. The cattle lowed in the distance, waiting for water. The rooster crowed again down the road. Normal sounds in a day that wasn't normal anymore. And somewhere in the study, in that locked drawer Elias had never opened, answers waited. Or maybe more questions. Either way, things were different now. The clock on the mantel ticked forward. 7:43 a.m. The longest day of the year, and it had only just begun. 3 weeks passed like water through cup hands. You could see it slipping away but couldn't do a thing to stop it. The summer grass that had been green and thick when Leland first rode in now turned brown and brittle at the edges. The days came hot and stayed hot, and the nights offered little relief. Elias noticed every change. The way the creek ran lower. The way the cattle gathered near the big oak instead of grazing the far pasture. The way Cora stopped walking up the hill to visit her daddy's grave. She used to go every Sunday without fail. Rain or shine. Would take a handful of wildflowers and sit there for an hour, just thinking. Elias would watch from the barn or the workshop, keeping his distance but keeping an eye. That was his job. His purpose. Now the grave sat empty at the top of the hill, and Cora sat at the kitchen table staring at walls. Leland had made himself comfortable in the bunkhouse. Too comfortable. He ate with them some nights, invited by Cora because she didn't know how to say no. He talked with his mouth full about cattle prices and fencing repairs and all the things he planned to do with his half of the ranch. Cora would push food around her plate and not eat. Elias would grip his fork until his knuckles went white. But he never said anything. Never stood up. Never did what a real protector would do. That was the part that aided him most. On the 18th day, Elias found himself in the tack room, alone with the smell of leather and saddle soap. A cracked mirror hung on the wall near the window, the kind nobody bothered to replace because it did the job well enough. Elias caught his reflection in it and stopped. Grey at the temples. Lines around the eyes. A face that had seen plenty and done little. He saw himself clearly for the first time in years. Not a protector. Just a man who'd hung around too long, hoping feelings he never acted on might somehow turn into something real. A groundskeeper for a ghost. A coward wearing a cowboy hat. The thought sat heavy in his chest like a stone. Because here was the truth of it. He loved her. Had loved her since the first winter he spent here, when she'd brought him coffee in the barn and stood talking about nothing for an hour just to have company. Had loved her through her daddy's death, through the hard years after, through every quiet morning and every ordinary evening. And he'd never said a word. Never risked a thing. Just stayed useful and hoped that would be enough. Now Leland was here, and Elias still wasn't saying anything. The impossible choice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. September 9th, Elias remembered the date because the sky did that thing it does before autumn, going a deeper blue, like it knew what was coming. Cora found him in the barn, mending a harness he didn't really need to mend. She stood in the doorway with the light behind her, and she looked so tired it hurt to see. "I think you should go," she said. Elias stopped working. Set down the harness low. "What?" She wouldn't meet his eyes. "Leland's got a legal claim. Lawyers called yesterday. It's real, Elias. Half this place is his now. And he's not going anywhere. I'm not afraid of Leland." "I know." Her voice cracked a little. "That's what scares me. He's got friends, Elias. People he called. People coming to help him run this place. And you're just one man." Elias stood up. "I can be enough." She looked at him then, really looked, and there was something in her eyes that broke his heart. "I know you think that. But I can't watch you get hurt trying to save something that's already half gone. You've given me 7 years. 7 good years. I can't ask for more." She turned and walked out before he could answer. Elias stood in the barn with the afternoon light slanting through the boards and the smell of hay in his nose and the worst kind of emptiness in his chest. She wasn't protecting the ranch anymore. She was protecting him. And he'd let her. That night, Elias packed his truck. Not much to pack. A few clothes. Some tools that were his. The photograph he kept in his wallet. The one of Cora laughing at something at the county fair 3 years back. He put the truck keys on the kitchen table where she'd find them in the morning. Then he sat in the dark and waited for dawn. But sleep wouldn't come. And around 2 a.m., he made a decision. He drove into Livingston instead of away from it. Parked outside a small house on B Street, the one belonging to a retired marshal named Walt Pena. Walt was 73 now, wore yellow shoes because he said they made him feel young, and knew more about Park County than anybody alive. Walt answered the door in his bathrobe, squinting at the headlights in his driveway. "Elias, you know what time it is. Need to ask you something. About Cora's daddy." Walt studied him a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Coffee's old, but it's hot." They sat in Walt's kitchen, the clock on the wall ticking loud. Elias explained about Leland. About the paper. About the claim. Walt listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, Walt stared at his coffee cup for a long time. "Shame about his gambling," Walt finally said. "Good man otherwise. But that habit, it aided him." Elias leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Walt rubbed his chin. "I mean he didn't just lose to Leland. He was in deep with half the county. Sold that horse ranch of his twice over before he died, just on paper. Promises he couldn't keep." The words landed like physical blows. Elias felt the world tilt sideways. Sold it to who else? Few people. Small debts. Nothing major. But the big one. There was a woman over in Sweetgrass County. Widow named Margaret Klein. Your man Leland, he must have bought the debt from her. That's the only way he'd have a claim. Elias's mind raced. So the paper he showed us. Probably real. But it don't make him the owner. Just makes him the guy holding the debt. The actual owner, the one with the legal right to sell, that's Margaret Klein. And far as I know, she's never even seen the place. Elias sat back in his chair. The kitchen felt suddenly too small. And then he realized the debt to Leland was a lie. Not the paper. The paper was real. But Leland's right to it? His claim of ownership? That was built on sand. He was just the middleman, pretending to be the king. Elias looked at Walt. Where does Margaret Klein live? Walt smiled slow. About 60 miles east of here. Small place outside Big Timber. You planning a drive? Elias was already standing. Soon as the sun comes up. Walt walked him to the door. At the threshold, he put a hand on Elias's arm. You know what you're doing, son. Elias thought about Cora in that barn doorway, telling him to leave to keep him safe. Thought about 7 years of mornings and the wobbly brass knob and all the things he'd never said. Yeah, he said. For the first time in a while, I think I do. The sky was starting to lighten in the east as he drove back toward the ranch. Pink and gold and the kind of pretty that made you want to believe in second chances. Leland's truck sat outside the bunkhouse. Cora's light was on upstairs. Elias parked and walked to the kitchen door. Put his hand on that wobbly brass knob. And for the first time in 7 years, he turned it like a man who knew exactly what he was walking toward. The nights had turned cold enough that Elias could see his breath in the truck cab, even with the heater running. September 23rd. 3 days since Walt's kitchen and the truth about Margaret Klein. 3 days of driving, talking, waiting. He found her place just outside Big Timber, like Walt said. Small white house with a wraparound porch and a barn that needed paint. Margaret Klein was 71, widowed 12 years, and she answered the door holding a dish towel like she'd been expecting someone. Elias told her everything. The ranch. Leland. The debt Cora's daddy never paid. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she invited him in for coffee and told him her own story. Her husband had loaned money to Cora's daddy back in 2013. A handshake deal between old friends. When her husband passed, the debt became hers. But she never pushed for payment. Never even visited the property. It just sat there on paper, a piece of someone else's life she didn't know what to do with. Then, 18 months back, a man with a snake tattoo showed up at her door. Offered to buy the debt for pennies on the dollar. Said he had a personal interest in the ranch. Margaret didn't like his eyes, but money was tight and the offer was cash. She sold. That man was Leland. Elias explained what that meant. That Leland didn't own the ranch. He just owned the right to collect a debt. A debt that, legally, could be paid off by someone else. Margaret studied him across her kitchen table. You want to buy it from me? The debt? No. I want you to sell it to Cora. Direct. Cut Leland out completely. Margaret thought about that for a long moment. Then she nodded slow. I never wanted to cause that girl trouble. Her daddy was a good man with a bad habit. There's a difference. 3 days of paperwork. 3 days of phone calls and county officers and lawyers who spoke in language that made Elias's head hurt. Margaret handled most of it. She was sharp, that woman. Knew how to make things happen. On September 26th, Elias drove back to the ranch with a folder on the passenger seat. Inside was a legal document transferring Margaret Klein's claim to Cora Lee Thompson. The debt was paid. The ranch was whole again. Cora owned it all except Leland's story, which was about to fall apart. The sun sat low in the sky when Elias turned onto the ranch road. Late afternoon, That golden hour when everything looked soft and possible. He saw the cattle first, gathered near the big oak like always. Then the house, warm light in the kitchen window. Then the yard. Leland was loading cattle into a trailer. Not his cattle. Cora's. The best ones, the ones with the best bloodlines, the ones her daddy had spent 20 years building. Leland had 2 men with him, rough-looking types, and they were working fast like they had somewhere to be. Elias parked the truck and got out slow, the folder in his hand. Leland saw him and grinned that gold-tooth grin. Well, look who came back. Thought you'd left for good. Elias walked toward him. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. Where's Cora? Leland waved toward the house. Inside. Crying probably. Told her I was taking what's mine. She didn't take it well. Elias kept walking. Stopped about 10 feet from Leland. Held up the folder. See this? It's a document from Margaret Klein, the woman you bought the debt from. Turns out she never stopped owning it legally. She just sold you the right to collect. And now she's sold that right to Cora. Leland's grin faded slow. That don't change nothing. It changes everything. You don't own anything here. You never did. You're just a man with a piece of paper that's about as useful as yesterday's news. Leland stared at him. The 2 men stopped working, watching the scene unfold. You're lying, Leland said. I'm not. Call the county clerk. Call a lawyer. Call anybody. But those cattle stay here. Leland's jaw tightened. The snake tattoo on his throat seemed to pulse with his anger. He took a step toward Elias, then another. You think you're brave. Leland's voice dropped low. You think showing up with papers makes you a hero? You've been hiding on this ranch for 7 years, too scared to tell that girl how you feel. Too scared to live your own life. And now you want to play tough. Elias felt the words hit. Every one of them true. He had hidden. Had stayed safe in the background while the world moved on. But not anymore. Maybe, Elias said quiet. But I'm here now. Leland pulled a knife. It happened fast. The blade caught the late sunlight, gleaming sharp. The 2 men behind him shuffled back, not wanting any part of this. Leland moved forward, knife low, eyes hard. I'm taking those cattle, he said. And if you get in my way, I'm taking you too. Elias didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just stood there with the folder in his hand and 7 years of quiet in his bones. The distance between them shrank. 10 feet became 8. 8 became 6. Then the kitchen door banged open. Cora stood on the porch, and in her hand she held a branding iron. The end glowed red-hot, fresh from the stove. She must have been watching through the window, must have seen the knife appear, must have moved without thinking. Elias, the brand, she screamed. Leland turned at the sound, and in that half-second, everything shifted. He saw the iron, saw Cora's face, saw Elias moving toward him. But Elias didn't grab for the knife, didn't try to be a hero. He just held up the folder and spoke calm. This ends today, Leland. One way or another. You walk away now. You walk away with nothing. You stay, you leave in handcuffs. Your choice. Leland looked at the folder, at the iron, at Elias. The knife wavered in his hand. The 2 men behind him had already backed to their truck. One of them called out, "This ain't worth it, Leland. Let's go." For a long moment, nobody moved. The cattle shifted in the trailer. A bird sang somewhere in the oak tree. The sun kept sinking. Then Leland spat on the ground and folded the knife. This ain't over. He walked to his truck, climbed in, and squealed out of the yard, dust rising behind him in a thick cloud. The 2 men followed fast. Elias stood in the settling dust, breathing hard. The folder was damp in his hand from gripping it so tight. He looked up at the porch. Cora still held the branding iron, but it was cooling now, the glow fading. She set it down slow and walked toward him. When she reached him, She didn't say anything. Just put her arms around him and held on. Elias held her back. Felt her shake. Felt the warmth of her after all these years of keeping his distance. "I thought you left," she whispered. "I tried," he said. "Couldn't do it." They stood there in the fading light while the cattle lowed and the first stars appeared and the world slowly remembered how to be peaceful again. The trailer sat half-loaded in the yard. Leland's work, unfinished. Tomorrow they'd unload those cattle, put them back where they belonged. But tonight, Elias just held on. The first snow of the year came on October 12th. Not much, just a thin white blanket that covered the yard and softened every sharp edge. The churned mud where Leland's truck had sat was smooth now, clean, like none of it ever happened. Elias stood at the back door, watching it fall. His breath made little clouds in the cold morning air. The brass knob in his hand was new. Solid. Heavy. No wobble at all. He'd found it at a hardware store in Livingston 2 weeks back. Spent 20 minutes just holding different ones, feeling the weight, testing the turn. The woman at the counter had asked if he needed help. He'd said no, thanks. This was something he needed to figure out himself. Now here it was. Installed. Perfect. The kind of knob that meant business. Elias turned it slow, the way he always did, but this time it didn't give that little loose rattle. Just clicked firm and opened smooth. He stepped inside. The kitchen was warm. Cora stood at the stove, stirring something in a big pot that smelled like beef and onions and herbs. She'd gotten good at stew over the years, learned from her daddy's recipes, added a few of her own. The kitchen smelled like home in a way Elias never let himself notice before. On the windowsill above the sink sat a small, unremarkable rock. Grey. Smooth. About the size of his palm. Elias had seen it 1,000 times without really seeing it. It used to live behind the old brass knob, jammed in there to keep the door from sagging. A temporary fix that lasted 7 years. Now it sat in the light, just a paperweight. Nothing holding anything together anymore. Cora glanced over her shoulder. "Snow's pretty." "Coming down steady," Elias said. "Should have a few inches by nightfall." She nodded and went back to stirring. Comfortable silence. The kind that comes from years of mornings, years of knowing someone's rhythms. Elias set the old brass knob on the counter. He'd kept it, for some reason. Couldn't throw it away. It sat there next to the salt pig and the jar of wooden spoons, looking smaller than it should, all its wobble gone because it wasn't attached to anything anymore. Cora looked at it. Then at him. A small smile tugged at her mouth. 7 years, she said. 7 years. Never once complained about that door. Elias shrugged. Didn't seem worth complaining about. She turned from the stove, faced him proper. Her hair was different now, a little longer, a little grayer at the temples. Same thing happening to him. Funny how you could live with someone without really living with them, and still change together. "Elias," she said. He waited. "I'm glad you stayed." Simple words. 4 of them. But the way she said it, the way her eyes held his, it meant more than any long speech could. Elias nodded. "Me too." She turned back to the stew. He walked to the window and stood there, looking out at the snow. The fence line where Leland's truck once parked was just a fence line now. Posts and wire and falling snow. Nothing threatening. Nothing waiting. The cattle were bunched near the barn, smart enough to get out of the weather. Elias could see their dark shapes through the white, steam rising off their backs. The big oak stood bare-limbed and patient, waiting for spring like it always did. A truck went by on the county road, slow in the snow. Not stopping. Just passing. Elias thought about Leland. Word had come through Walt that he'd left the state, headed south somewhere. Arizona, maybe. Somewhere warm where people didn't ask questions. The 2 men with him had scattered too, back to whatever lives they'd left temporary. The ranch was quiet now. Really quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like rest instead of waiting. Behind him, Cora moved around the kitchen, setting the table, pulling bread from the warmer. Ordinary sounds that Elias had heard thousands of times but never really listened to. He turned from the window. Need help with anything? She considered him. You could pour the water. Elias got 2 glasses from the cupboard, filled them from the tap, set them on the table, one on each side, across from each other. Same table they'd eaten at for 7 years. Same chairs. Same view out the window. But different now. Cora brought the stew pot over, set it on the trivet, ladled out 2 bowls. The steam rose between them, fragrant and warm. She sat down. He sat down. For a moment, neither moved. Just sat there with the snow falling outside and the stew cooling and all the words that hadn't been said hanging in the air like the steam. Then Cora picked up her spoon, looked at him across the table. Supper's ready. 4 words. Simple words. The kind families said every night all across the country. But Elias heard them different. Heard the welcome in them. The belonging. The thing he'd been too scared to reach for all these years. He picked up his spoon. Looks good, he said. They ate. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the yard, covering the tracks, making everything new and clean and possible. Elias chewed his stew and watched Cora eat across from him. Watched the way she blew on her spoon to cool it. Watched the way her eyes crinkled when something tasted especially good. Little things he'd seen 1,000 times but never let himself keep. He kept them now. After supper, they did the dishes together. Her washing, him drying. Same as always. But his hand brushed hers when she passed a plate, and neither one pulled away. Through the kitchen window, the snow continued. The fence line disappeared under white. The world got smaller, quieter, wrapped in soft. When the dishes were done, Cora made tea. They sat at the table with their mugs and watched the dark come. First snow always feels like a beginning, Cora said. Elias considered that. Feels like an ending too. Maybe they're the same thing. He looked at her. She looked back. No words needed. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 7:42 p.m. Different from that first morning when it read 5:47 and everything was about to change. Different from 7:12 when Leland stood at the gate. Different from all the times in between. Just 7:42 on a snowy evening in October. Ordinary. Perfect. Later, Elias walked to the back door one last time before bed. Put his hand on the new brass knob. Solid. Firm. No wobble. He didn't need to go out. Nothing waited. No threats to check. No shadows to watch. He just stood there, hand on the knob, looking through the window at the snow. Behind him, Cora's footsteps on the stairs. The creak of a bedroom door. The soft sounds of settling. Elias turned from the door. Walked through the kitchen. Paused at the windowsill. The small grey rock sat there in the dark. He touched it once, just fingertips, remembering. Then he climbed the stairs. In the morning, there would be more snow. Tracks to make. Cattle to feed. A ranch to run. Ordinary work for ordinary days. But tonight, the snow fell and the house stood warm and 2 people slept under the same roof, finally home in the same way. The wobbly brass knob sat on the kitchen counter, retired from duty. A reminder of what had been. A measure of how far they'd come. And outside, the fence line disappeared under white, and the world held its breath, and everything that needed saying had been said without words at all.